It just hits your soul in a really intense way. It's so fantastic. Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I am Molly, and in this video I'm going to be talking about the album And Again Into the Light by the black metal band Panopticon. Now this is Panopticon's 9th studio album, and I will be honest, I'm not at all familiar with the band's previous work before this album. What I know about Panopticon, I think it's mostly just a one-man band formed by Austin Lunn. He does a lot of the work himself, and it's pretty impressive what he can pull off. But this most recent album that I've listened to, And Again Into the Light, it came out earlier this year, and I recently listened to it. I've been getting into it, and it just has a fantastic sound, and yeah, I just felt compelled to film this little review, kind of talking about it, just giving my thoughts and opinions on this album. So track 1 on this album is actually the title track, And Again Into the Light. This is a shorter one, kind of a melodic start to the album. It starts off not black metal at all. I would describe it as more of like a folksy, bluesy kind of sound, kind of a bluegrass sound. And there's a lot of kind of twangy instrumentals going on. It has a very mournful tone to it, but it's very heavy on the string instruments. It has a very orchestral sound to it, and like I said, not black metal at all. Based on this album anyway, Panopticon definitely seems to infuse a lot of more natural, like I said, bluegrass, kind of folksy instrumentation into black metal, and they fuse those two sounds really well. But yeah, And Again Into the Light, the first track on this album, definitely a very calm start to the album and kind of goes down that more bluegrass, folksy sounding direction. Alright, moving on. Track 2, we have Dead Loons. This one is fantastic. This track is so good. I think it's my favorite on the entire album. It starts off again a little bit slower, more melodic. There's less of that orchestral sound to it though, which almost gives it a more cold, isolated feeling when you're listening to it. And then as the song progresses, there's that point where the instrumental wave of more the traditional black metal sound hits you. It just completely overtakes you. It just hits your soul in a really intense way. It's so fantastic. It's just got this really heavy, crushing immensity to its sound, paired with how melodic the track starts, and then you just have this wave of sound flood in. It's just fantastic, this part of the song. I also picked up on this track, there's a very steady percussive element. It's almost like a pulse. It's kind of giving the track a bit of a heartbeat in a way. And then later on, the strings return, again, kind of bringing a little bit of warmth back into the sound of this album. And then by this track's close, it's just a crazy whirlwind of different instruments going on, and what really stands out to me is the violin. It's so beautiful. You just wouldn't have guessed something so organic and warm sounding as a violin paired with the kind of colder, more obtuse sounds of black metal combined. You never would have guessed that it would have sounded good, but it sounds beautiful on this track. Track 3 is Rope Burn Exit. This one has a little bit of a heavier sound to it, and it's just got really driving vocals and percussion going on. The injection of the violin from time to time just gives it almost a sense of fragility, even though it has this really strong, powerful, dense sound to it. The violin just kind of lightens it up a little bit. It gives it a tiny bit of airiness that I think is needed. And yeah, it just provides a great contrast in sounds yet again, just creating that really cool dynamic going on. And then there's kind of a cool transition between the end of Rope Burn Exit into the next track. It almost sounds like choir-like vocals going on toward the tail end of this track. And then a Snowless Winter kind of picks off right where Rope Burn Exit ended. It's kind of like a continuation of that last track. So it's got all of that crazy intense energy going on that Rope Burn Exit had, and then at around the 4-minute mark, a Snowless Winter changes it up a little bit. They go a little bit more quiet, melodic, they pull it in a little bit. It just has a very shimmery sound to it. I don't know how else to describe it. And then they throw in these little like screeching sounds which give it so much atmosphere. There's a ton of atmosphere on this album. It really transports you to a place. Like, I always feel like I'm in the woods or something in autumn. That's just the feeling this album gives me. And then this quiet little restrained part of the track, it's almost like a moment of contemplation before the driving instrumentals are just reintroduced to this song. And then around the 10-minute mark, they introduce what I think is some sort of electric guitar. That's kind of what it sounds like. And it's a little bit echoey sounding. And then there's kind of this footstep approaching sound before they just reintroduce the intense, crazy instrumentals and vocals. And then the track ends with that electric guitar again. It's just a fantastic track. It brings so much energy, such a great delivery on this one. Track 5 is Moth-Eaten Soul. This one has very interesting vocals. They're a little bit on the more growly sounding side. I think this track just kind of has a little bit of, again, like a harder edge to it. It's definitely got kind of a haunting sound. Later on, they infuse some church bells into this track, and again, with the whole sense of place thing, they definitely bring in some ambient sounds to enhance that feeling of being somewhere. And just the infusion of the church bells and then that violin, this track almost induces like a sense of panic when you listen to it. It's just got a panicky feeling to it. And then toward the end of this track, there's a very unexpected vocal. It's like a futuristic sounding person talking, but it just provides a really interesting contrast, that talking bit with the really organic sounding instrumentals and bells. Track 6 is Her Golden Laughter Echoes. This one reminds me of the first track, the title track, in that it definitely goes in the more folk sounding bluegrass direction again with its sound. And this track is also really short. It's I think about a minute long or so. I would describe it as almost more of an interlude of sorts. Just a very calm, relaxing track. Kind of needed after that last one that kind of had this panicky sound to it. There's some ambient sounds still being used on this one. They throw some banjo in. It just has this very bluegrass, relaxed sound to it. Again, not really the genre I find myself listening to typically, but on this album it works. It somehow works really well with all the black metal and intensity going on. Track 7 is The Embers at Dawn. This one definitely starts more slow, melodic, kind of trance-like, very hypnotic. It just puts you in a trance of sorts. The vocals are much more calmer too. They kind of just flow over the instrumentals really well. And this track just very gradually builds up until we have that crescendo right about at the halfway point of this track that just floods you again with so much energy on the delivery of this one. But to me, this track just has a very triumphant sound to it. It almost sounds like some sort of demon or something has finally been vanquished. It's like the sound of freedom. But it's really interesting that there's a lyric that repeats, "Don't save me, I'm only going down," which is not very triumphant or hopeful sounding. It's just kind of an interesting combination. It makes you think like maybe the freedom is in finally giving up. Kind of interesting, but that was just the feeling I had listening to this track, is a sense of freedom and finally overcoming something. And then this track ends with a really cool, atmospheric, almost futuristic sounding ending to it. And then closing things out is track 8, No Hope. This one, right off the bat, just goes hard with the instrumentals. Really, really crazy. It definitely brings the energy, and I love how dense this track sounds. And then around the 6-minute mark, they introduce kind of that airy percussion, which infuses it with just a little bit of a lighter sound to it. And then when they introduce the woman talking, really interesting, almost interlude in the middle of this track, and I just love the lyrics of it. It's all about basically finding hope in the most despairing situations. And then at the 8-minute 50-second mark, this track just blows me away. It's so good. The delivery here is absolutely incredible. Totally gives me goosebumps. And then you just have the lyrics, "Never give up, never give in," being repeated. Definitely makes sense that this track name is No Hope, because it's just such a hopeful ending to this album. Basically that in the absolute depths of despair, you can always find that little glimmer of light somewhere in some form. And then the warm cello closing this track out is just, it's like you're finding that light almost. It brings this warm sound to this track. And then it finally just finishes up with, again, very ambient sounding stuff. I think it's birds or something, bird calls. Just absolutely amazing. It blows me away every time I listen to it. It just is a beautiful, beautiful track and a great ending to this album. So there you have it. There's my little review of sorts of And Then Again Into the Light, the 9th studio album from the band Panopticon. This album is fantastic. Definitely one of my favorite albums of 2021 so far. I love the sound of it. I love the infusion of all the different elements and sounds going on here. And if you haven't heard it, definitely give this album a listen. Definitely let me know down in the comments what your thoughts are on this album. And yeah, as usual, thank you all so much for watching. Stay tuned, and I will see you in the next video.